Morning, everyone. Hope you are all doing well. Just waiting for people to join the session. Thank you for joining us today on our session about the temporary skilled migration income threshold. I can see already that I've got the heading for that one not quite right. So just a moment, and once everyone has joined, we'll start the session. Thank you for your patience. I'm sure you're all very familiar with the standard webinar rigmarole by now, but we should be underway in just a moment. It's been a very exciting couple of months in the world of immigration. I don't use exciting in the sense that it's been a lot of fun. It has been very challenging. There's been a number of significant challenges across the board. And I think we're going to see ongoing challenges. Obviously, the economic situation in Australia is very complicated. I think that no one really knows what is going on in any great depth. And one of the challenges that we see is this sort of ongoing mismatch between the need for skilled workers and some existing sort of um, slowdowns in the economy, I guess you would say. Different sectors are obviously responding very differently. But in the immigration space, it's not just the economic pressures, it is very much the political pressures. As I'm sure you're all aware, those political pressures are very deep, they're ongoing, they're not looking to stop anytime soon. And I think that it's something that we all have to recognise is going to be a problem into the future. The level of migration in Australia at this point in time is very, very high. It's one of the high points, I think, since the 1870s and the gold rush in terms of the number of temporary visa holders who are present in Australia. And that's causing a lot of different challenges. And I think that those challenges aren't going to go away. And the government is trying to do what it can to address those challenges, but that is not at all obvious, particularly when the opposition party is looking to score points around the issues related to temporary migration. But enough about the broader context. I know everyone's here to hear about the new changes to the temporary skilled migration income threshold and how it might be affecting their business. Um, Throughout the session, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions. If you do have any questions, there should be a Q&A panel in the interface that you can enter any questions, and we'll address those as we go on through the session. I will look at them from time to time to see if they're filling up. So if you have anything that you'd like to ask, please feel free to put it in there. But onwards and upwards, today we'll be talking about the background to the temporary skilled migration income threshold. It was not a major feature of the migration program for a long time, in the sense that it was paused from about 2013 until last year. And that made the TSMIT, as it's called, perhaps less of a significant factor within the program. But if you go back to the period between 2007, when it was introduced, and 2013, or 2008, sorry, and 2013, you will recall, or those of you who were around at that time would note, that it was a major issue each financial year. And it was something that employers had to deal with and really had to grapple with. And I think this session's been prepared in that light, with quite a bit of detail. And these slides are available for you all after the session if that's something that you would like to see. So we'll talk about how TSMIT and market salary rates interact, because these two concepts work together. We'll talk about the scope of how that changes things for organisations, particularly where you have a significant reliance on these 482 visa holders. We'll talk a little bit about labour market testing, and then we'll run through some scenarios about the different impacts that the TSMIT changes can have on businesses. And I would really like to, engage with everyone here if you have questions, because this can be quite complicated. And I think that's probably the greatest value that people are going to be able to pull out of this session, is to have that sort of interactive opportunity to talk about how is TSMIT going to affect us in a given scenario. So by way of background, the 457 visa program is the main work visa, and has or was from 1994 through until about 2018. It was the flagship program. Really, there were very few other options for any sort of long-term work, and it was subject to a lot of reforms over many, many years. In 2007, 2008, one of these big reforms came through, and we had this concept of TSMIT, or temporary skilled migration income threshold, introduced. And we'll look at what that means in some detail on the next screen. In 2013, after a change of government to the Liberal National Party, it was decided that TSMIT would cease to be indexed. Now, the validity of that decision is very much open to discussion. It was a very political decision in many respects, and we'll look at a little bit about that in a second. In 2018, the 457 visa program closed, but effectively was rebadged as the 482 visa program. There were some significant changes, but it continued to be the flagship work visa for Australia. And then in 2023, the Albanese Labor government has decided to re-implement indexation of the TSMIT from that 53,900. It was sitting at 53,900 from 2013 until last July, when it moved to 70,000. Now, that's a big jump, but if you actually go back and you look at the figures that were in place between 2008 and 2013, it sort of went up from, sort of 47,000, 49,000, 51,000, 53,000. And the 70,000 figure is actually based on indexation from 2013. Okay, so the theory was that the wages that temporary visa holders should have been earning through that period have been corrected for, and we've now caught up with where indexation should be. And of course, from the 1st of July this year, we see another move in TSMIT to the figure of 73,150 guaranteed annual earnings, or base remuneration. That's a fairly big jump, but it is in line with our back of the envelope calculations around things like wage increases over the last 12 months, being somewhere around 4 to 4.2%. So how does TSMIT work in the 482 visa program? I guess this is one for people who are newer to the space. The 482 visa program is made up of three main components. You've got the sponsorship, which relates to the business, the nomination, which relates to the role, and the visa, which relates to the individual who's going to fill that role. The TSMIT, or temporary skilled migration income threshold, is essentially a salary floor that relates to the nomination. So in essence, if a position is going to be paid less than the TSMIT, it is not considered to be eligible for the 482 visa program. And there's a couple of different justifications for that. One of them being that it's not considered sufficiently skilled for that, for the nomination and for the 482 program. And secondly, there is a question in the TSMIT figure around what amount of money does a temporary visa holder need to earn in Australia, without access to Medicare, without access to government schooling, without access to the various social security measures that permanent residents and citizens receive in order to live a reasonable life in Australia. Now, that's very problematic in the sense that the amount of money that it costs to live in Shepparton versus Coogee Beach versus, on the Gold Coast, or the cost for a single individual versus a family of six, they're all very different figures. But the government has essentially determined in its great wisdom that this TSMIT is the amount of money that needs to be paid. The other factor to be aware of is that the figure also applies to the subclass 186 permanent residency program, and that has some impacts in terms of the ongoing obligation to pay what's called market salary rates. That's obviously a new term that I've just introduced to the session, but we'll deal with on the next slide. So this relationship between market salary rates, i.e. what a position should be paid, and the TSMIT is an ongoing dialogue, if you will, and it's something that continues across the lifespan of a 482 visa holder, and it also impacts on that pathway to permanent residency. So this, when we talk about scope of the impact of the TSMIT changes, this is what I mean. It's not just about that next nomination. It's about wages within your business more broadly. It's about the wages of Australians. It's about the wages of temporary visa holders, and it's about that pathway to permanent residency at the end. So it is quite broad, and it has the potential to have quite significant salary impacts across the business. So introducing some of these key concepts for us. Guaranteed annual earnings. Now, guaranteed annual earnings is used in the migration regulations as a way of describing what might otherwise be called base earnings. Okay, so the classic example is simply salary plus salary excluding remuneration. Okay, that's the simplest metric. The TSMIT does apply to the 494 as well. Thank you for the question, Isiani. It does apply to the 494. It applies to 482 and the 494 and the 186. The 494 visa probably hasn't been mentioned as much, or hasn't been mentioned in this session, because it really isn't something that we've seen a great deal of take up of. The number of visa grants in that space is very minimal, but it does apply. And there are a lot of concerns being raised about that, because the subclass 494 visa, for those who aren't aware, the skilled employer-sponsored regional visa is designed to be, in theory, concessional. It's designed to have a lower threshold than a visa in the city, because regional employers have different needs. But the TSMIT applies in the same way. So the 494 is subject to the TSMITs. Thank you for the question. That's a really good point. So back to guaranteed annual earnings. We're talking about base remuneration without super, and anything that can be calculated upfront with certainty. So a car, tool of the trade, novated lease type arrangement, a phone with a specific value, $80 plan across 12 months, that's $960. So guaranteed annual earnings are the costs that can be worked out in advance, but it doesn't include things like overtime typically, bonuses, particularly like sales and commission bonuses. Those are things that cannot be included. Okay, so we've got this guaranteed annual earnings figure, and that is what the department uses when it looks at how much an individual is being paid. And so generally speaking, when we talk about base remuneration, we are referring to guaranteed annual earnings as assessed by the Department of Home Affairs based on the regulations. Now, why is guaranteed annual earnings relevant? Well, guaranteed annual earnings is the amount that you'll be talking about when you apply for a nomination. Okay, The department doesn't want your calculation of earnings. They want you to use their formula, which is this GAE. So GAE relates to market salary rates because the market salary rate is the amount of money that would be paid to an Australian in the same job. So let's say that you are a gelato maker working in Geelong. How much would a gelato maker be paid in Geelong with your experience and skills if they were an Australian? Okay. That is the market salary rate concept. And when we look at that, we need to be talking in guaranteed annual earnings. Okay, so our gelato maker might just receive an hourly salary of $40, and that $40 across 40 hours a week is going to be around 80,000 a year. So we can say our guaranteed annual earnings is $80,000 a year. Okay, and the market salary rate, which is what you would pay an Australian, is $80,000 a year. Now, there can be some conflation in these different concepts, okay? And I will try and unpick it as we go along. It can be a bit tricky at times, but market salary rate is essentially what an Australian should be paid, okay? If there is an Australian in the business who is doing the same job at the same level, how much are they paid? If there is no one, how much would a hypothetical Australian be paid? And we'll talk a bit more about how you unpack that. Temporary skilled migration income threshold. Again, this is the salary floor. It is not a complex concept because it is just a dollar figure that the government basically picks out based on its calculations, etc. It's not a random number. It's got its reasons, but it is basically a salary floor. And if the market salary rate, okay, $80,000 for our gelato maker in Geelong, is below the temporary skilled migration income threshold, the position is not eligible. So our gelato maker is on 80,000. The TSMIT is going to 73,150. Therefore, our gelato maker's market salary rate is above the TSMIT and everything's fine. Okay. We'll work on this a bit more as we go through these scenarios. Now, the other concept that you might want to be aware of is labour market testing. Now, labour market testing is only relevant in the sense that where it's required, you must include the amount of money you're going to be paying that role. It can be a range or it can be a specific dollar figure, but it needs to be consistent with the market salary rate. So you can't, as an organisation, advertise for a role at $65,000, knowing that for a gelato maker, you can't advertise for a gelato maker role at $65,000, knowing that the correct market salary rate is 80,000. Okay, because when it comes time, so two reasons. When it comes time to put forward to the department why you're paying 65,000, you won't be able to justify it. Okay, because you've got evidence in whatever form that gelato makers should earn 80,000. Okay, number one. And number two, of course, because it's below the TSMIT, and the TSMIT's going to be 73,150. We've advertised at 65,000. That's inconsistent. Our application is going to fall over. And there's every chance that we will lose our money and not get a refund. So I hope everyone loves a nice little chart. Market salary rates are the amount that would be paid to an Australian in an equivalent role in the same location. Okay, let's pick that apart a little bit. Well, actually, first let's go through the process and then we'll pick it apart. So the process is starting in the top left-hand corner. Let's talk about our Geelong gelato maker. Is there an equivalent Australian worker in this, or is there an Australian in an equivalent role in the same location? Okay. Now, what is an equivalent role? Well, we might have gelato maker already in our existing business, and their remuneration will tell us how much the appropriate market salary rate is. okay? Because in theory, we're paying that Australian how much you should pay. That does not mean that you're paying more than your industry competitors. It does not necessarily mean that you're paying the average in your industry, or necessarily that you're paying lower. There is obviously a range in these scenarios. However, if you've got a single individual who is a gelato maker, full stop, and they are earning $75,000, then you can't go out and say that the market salary rate is 65,000 or 80,000. Okay. So an equivalent role when there's one person is typically going to be the remuneration of that one other person. If we have a scenario where we have multiple people, we have 5 gelato makers on hand. It's a very big gelateria. We've got 5 gelato makers and their remuneration ranges from 70,000 to 90,000. Then we can say that the market salary rate is this range, 70 to 90. Okay. What is an equivalent location? The department essentially says that this is at maximum at state level. So if you think you've got gelaterias all across Australia, what is the market rate in an area that is geographically close to Geelong? It needs to be in Victoria. What are they paid? Okay, so we don't have another gelato maker in our Geelong branch, but we do have one further down the road in Werribee, for example. Now, we do need to be a bit careful about this same location. There is likely to be a regional metro split. So comparing a wage that someone gets paid in South Yarra to what someone in Swan Hill is going to be paid is probably not comparable. Okay. But generally speaking, state level is the highest sort of level that you can be looking at, or the greatest geographic distance, but the closer you can get, the better. Okay. So is there an equivalent Australian? If yes, we ask, is there an applicable award? Okay, now an award can include an EBA, it can include a standard, modern award. If the answer is yes, the applicable rate, market salary rate, is the award that applies. Okay. If there is no award, then we need to look at what the Australian is being paid. Now, normally, if you applied this strictly, this would knock out most visas, most nominations from the system, because in many cases, the award rate is well below what is being paid. Okay. This is the way that the legislation is set out. But in fact, the department allows us to refer to the Australian. Okay. So even though this chart says you must refer to the award, in almost all cases, we would point to the Australian and we would say, well, yes, there is an award, but there is also an Australian, and the Australian's remunerated at above award rates, and that is X. Here's a copy of their salary payslip, contract with redacted details, whatever it might be. So it does appear, based on a strict application of this formula, that everything's going to fall over. But the reality is that the department has a bit more flexibility than that. Okay. Going down the other branch, is there an equivalent Australian worker? No. Is there an award? The rate is the award. Or if there is no award, go to external salary data. Now, again, this would break if it was strictly applied, but the reality is that Home Affairs will accept, almost without exception. I don't think I can recall any application being refused on this basis, the external market salary data. Now, what do we mean by external market salary data? We mean job advertisements from competitors. We mean salary surveys produced by recruitment companies such as Hayes, Hudson. There's lots of industry-specific recruitment surveys and that are published. And then sort of the best is likely to be sort of that Mercer salary data that's produced at a very high level. You have to pay a lot of money to get it, and it's basically used by very large businesses to sort of benchmark against competitors. Okay, so you've got different types of evidence that can be provided, and typically what we would do is provide 3 or 4 sources of evidence along with a statement explaining why the positions in the advertisements, for example, are relevant or related to the position that we're nominating, and why that is the correct market salary rate. Okay, so that is how we work out market salary rate. The legislation says that we're all going to crash into a brick wall around the award, but the reality is we either provide an equivalent Australian in the same location, or we provide external data. And we'll come back and we'll talk more about that concept around who is equivalent and where is equivalent, because that's really, really important. Next one, in terms of the TSMIT, you know, we've talked about this. It's not a complex concept of itself. What we need to do is we work out what is the MSR, what is the market salary rate, using that gross annual earnings concept. So we're only including certain amounts of money in that amount. That is what the MSR is. That's what the market salary rate. And then it's a simple question of, is it above or is it below the TSMIT? Okay. And that in itself is simple. Where it becomes complex is when we're talking about multiple employees employed across multiple years, including batches of Australians and non-Australians and this sort of stuff, and working out how that applies. And that's what we're going to dig a bit more into in a moment. In terms of the exceptions, there's no exceptions to guaranteed annual earnings. It's just a formula. It's a formula that you use to determine what a temporary visa holder is going to be paid. Market salary rates can be exempt. If a role is exempt from market salary rates, basically you don't need to go through the exercise of demonstrating why a person is paid a particular amount of money. But the amount is quite high, $250,000 guaranteed annual earnings. So a base remuneration of $250,000. Really, it is only executives at and above that sort of salary threshold, maybe a few consultant medical practitioners, but very few others. Temporary skilled migration income threshold always applies. Okay, so it is a blanket across Australia for both the 494 visas and the 482 visas and the 186 visas, nominations technically, but there are concessions that are available. And these concessions primarily come under the industry and company labour agreement. Pardon me, I've just been recovering from COVID, so I apologise for my coughing and my voice. Or designated area migration agreements. Now, if you're not familiar with these are essentially agreements that organisations can enter into with the Department of Home Affairs that allow you to negotiate specific concessions or reduced criteria for applications. The maximum discount you can get is 10%. Okay, so at present, with the TSMIT sitting at 70,000, if you have a labour agreement with a TSMIT discount, essentially you can pay your employees, like the market salary rate can be as low as 63,000. But next year, when the TSMIT next migration year, next financial year on the 1st of July, when the TSMIT goes up to 73,150, you will have to pay whatever 10% off 73,150 is. So the TSMIT does go up. It is indexed. It does increase. Okay, so even if you've got that discount, it will continue to go up. It is just that 10% less. And then finally, labour market testing. There's lots of exemptions to that based on industry, international trade obligations, as well as some specific occupation-based exceptions. Now, this is what I would describe as the meat of the session. It's really this question around how does TSMIT impact a business? So scenario A, we'll start with the simplest and we'll slow down a little bit more as we go. We've got a single widget engineer okay? And that role meets market salary rate in each year, okay? This person is a temporary visa holder. They're on a 482, okay? They were hired before 2023 or in 2023, and there's no equivalent Australian. So the employer has gone out into the market and they've looked at job advertisements, they've looked at other information, and they've said, okay, so this is what the market salary rate is. And you'll notice it just coincidentally happens to be only just above the TSMIT in each year, but it is higher than TSMIT. Okay, so it increases over time as the employer increases the person's wage. If you're an employer with subclass 482 visa holders, subclass 494 visa holders, you do have an ongoing obligation to pay market salary rates. Market salary rates are not a one-off. They are a moving feast. And as a result, over time, they will change. The remuneration that you paid to an employee 10 years ago is unlikely to be the market salary rate for today. Okay. So over time, this employee has moved up. They've moved from 55,000 to 70,000 to 75,000 effectively. In 2025, so let's say we're now the 1st of August 2020, sorry, not the 1st of August, let's say we're the 1st of, my goodness, we're the 1st of January 2025, okay? And this person's been employed in the business for 2 years. The TSMIT is now 73,150. Our employee has been employed for more than 2 years full time on the 482 visa, and therefore they qualify, broadly speaking, to apply for a subclass 186 permanent visa. As part of that application, the employer must demonstrate that what they are being paid is equivalent to market salary rates and that the market salary rate is above TSMIT. Now, in this instance, that is possible because the person is on 75,000 and the TSMIT is 73,150. Okay, so they're marginally above it. The other thing that can happen once this person moves through to permanent residency, they become an Australian as defined by the migration regulations for the purposes of these things. And that person's remuneration can then be referenced as an existing Australian in an equivalent role. So let's say on the 1st of February, the business decides to hire widget engineer number 2, and they're going to pay that person 75,000. Okay, they've advertised for the role. The remuneration in the advertisement was between 70 and 80,000. Okay, and they've looked at the person's skills, qualifications, and experience, and they've said, all right, we're going to pay this person 75,000. As part of that 482 nomination for this second person, they have used the contract of employment for widget engineer number 1 that shows that they are currently paid 75,000 as evidence for why a 482 visa holder in their business will be paid 75,000. Okay, so this scenario works. It works for widget engineer number 1 to go through to permanent residency, and it also works for widget engineer number 2 to be hired in February 2025. Looking at a different scenario. In this scenario, the person's remuneration, so this is again widget engineer number 1 in a parallel universe. The remuneration has increased over time, but it has stayed at 70,000, where the TSMIT has gone up to 73,150. Okay, so the person is now earning less than TSMIT. What does that mean? Let's say again on the 1st of July, the 1st of January 2025, widget engineer number 1 wants to apply for permanent residency. Well, they cannot meet the requirements for a 186 nomination at that time based on that salary. Okay, based on those guaranteed annual earnings of 70,000, that is below the TSMIT of 73,150. Therefore, they cannot be approved because market salary rates, okay, which is essentially what they're earning, is below the TSMIT figure. And this is how, um, TSMIT has an ongoing impact. Not TSMIT, well, TSMIT and market salary rates have an ongoing impact on individuals. Because if an individual, as they move through the system, does not stay in line with the market salary rate and above the TSMIT, then they're not going to be eligible. Equally, the employer in 2025 cannot use that existing employee in the business and say, well, yes, we'd like to hire a 482 visa holder. Here's an equivalent equivalent person that we've got. Let's say even if they were Australian, okay. If widget engineer number one was Australian, you can't turn and point to their remuneration and say, yes, we're paying market salary rates and it's above TSMIT, because it's not. It's at 70,000. So it's below TSMIT. And what you're talking about as being the market salary rate, i.e. what you pay your employee, is below TSMIT. Does that make sense? If you have any questions, please let me know. I've received a question in the chat about from someone who's applying for a 494 visa, about whether how TSMIT might impact them after 1 July. And the government has recently clarified that applications that are lodged before 1 July will still be assessed against the current TSMIT. Okay, so if you applied for a visa and you were nominated for a role at $70,050, you are at or above the current TSMIT, and your application will be assessed positively post 1 July. Okay, but you then have this question further down the track of access to permanent residency and so forth. Okay. Scenario C, we have multiple widget engineers. We've got Australian 1, 2, and 3. And then further down the track, we're going to look at hiring a 482 visa holder in financial year 2024. That's the person in green, okay? So we have multiple equivalent Australian workers. Here I've used a sort of a stepped line graph so that you can sort of see how the TSMIT sort of has increased over those years. Market salary rates for these employees have been assessed on an annual basis, and they have received remuneration increases. Okay. Now that in itself is not mandatory, but in some respects, I think it is probably a good indication of employers who are looking at the labour market and responding accordingly. But the market salary rate in the 2024 year is below TSMIT for 2 of the 3 Australians, okay? Australian 1 and Australian 2 in the 2024 financial year, they are sitting below, they're sitting below TSMIT. Okay. These 2 people here. So what does that mean? Essentially, it means that if the business wants to sponsor someone on a 482 visa, they need to demonstrate why the market salary rate that applies for the person is at or above the TSMIT threshold. Okay, so we've basically got a range of remuneration from 60,000 to 70,000. Okay, and only at that 70,000 point are people eligible in 2024 to be sponsored for a visa. So what you would have to argue here in order to be successful is that Australia number one has 1 year experience, Australia number two has 3 years experience, and Australia number five has 5 years. Australia number three has 5 years experience. Okay. And we're going to hire a 482 visa holder who has 6 years experience, hence why they are sitting above that salary threshold. Okay. So it is possible in this scenario, but it becomes increasingly difficult. And you do have to have some sort of basis, I would argue, to justify why these remuneration levels are different. Obviously, performance is a factor. Experience, performance, attitude, qualifications, they're all different sorts of things. However, you need to have a rational basis. And I would suggest that you probably should have a rational basis on paper, documented, in case that question comes up in future, either as part of an application or as part of an audit. The other thing that becomes a bit challenging is wage transparency laws are coming into effect that will mean that employers cannot prevent employees from discussing remuneration. Okay. This has the potential to cause a lot of issues if you're in a scenario where your 482 visa holders are artificially inflated. Okay. That could cause a lot of headaches across the business. Okay, just something to be conscious of. I'll move on to the next slide because I know that time is. Oh, I don't know how to delete my my annotations. There we go. So scenario C, we're talking about a situation in which some people meet the market salary rate. No, we're not. This is what we just did. Okay. Scenario D, none of our widget engineers meet the market salary rate. So you can see here, in contrast with the last time, the salaries have not kept up with TSMIT. Okay. So all of a sudden, our remuneration is falling well below that TSMIT threshold. Okay. None of the 3 Australians are above TSMIT. In this case, you cannot nominate a 482 visa holder on the basis that there is an equivalent Australian in the business. Now, what you may try and argue is that person 1, 2, and 3 have 1, 2, and 3 years experience, and the 482 visa holder has 4 years experience, and that's why they're sitting above it. But you start to run into very dangerous territory. Okay. Yeah, I think that is a fairly high risk approach. What is a less high risk approach is that the remuneration for these people increases to a figure which is above TSMIT. Okay. Or at least some of them do. Maybe not all of them. But obviously, that is a commercial decision, a very significant commercial decision, but it's something that you need to be aware of. And it's particularly important where, let's say, an award applies. Okay. Um, if you have a scenario where the award, well, let's say you pay everyone at award, you don't pay above award. Okay. Justifying that you're paying a temporary visa holder at a figure above is not going to work. Okay. You've got 80 Australians sitting on, you know, 70,000, but you're going to pay your temporary visa holder at 74. I don't think that's going to fly. The other scenario where this can be difficult is where you pay people at the award level, but all of a sudden your award level is above the TSMIT. Okay. So if you're saying to me, Jackson, we pay all of our employees the award, but the award is now above the TSMIT, depending on your pay grade, what's going to happen is you're going to have Actually, no, I think COVID's just got me. I apologize. I think that I'm going down an incorrect pathway there. I apologize. I don't think the award being higher than TSMIT is going to have a negative impact. I think it's just going to increase your wage bills. But that's something that organizations are going to have to deal with. So this is a scenario that does not work. The only real prospect is to raise one or more of these people above the TSMIT. If you cannot do so, then I think you're going to be in a real pickle. And this is where a lot of employers have a lot of challenges going forward because new entrants into the labour market are difficult to come across. Employers are struggling to find qualified people who meet their requirements, who want to stick around. Sponsoring people on temporary visas is becoming more difficult, and there will be fewer and fewer temporary visa holders in the system. The government's deliberate decision to suppress student visa numbers, cap student visa numbers, will mean that there are fewer people around for retail and hospitality roles, for roles in agriculture that have been there over the last couple of decades. Those people are going to be gone, or at least significantly reduced. So employers are really going to have to grapple with questions around remuneration, wage rates, and it must be said that this type of approach from the department does seem to be a deliberate effort on behalf of government to apply upward pressure on wages. Okay. There's a belief that the fact that the TSMIT was sitting at 53,900 for 10 years was a deliberate effort by previous government to suppress wage growth. And the Labor government have now definitely taken the lid off that. And the consequence is broader wage growth across industries and amongst Australians as well as temporary visa holders. Now, labour agreements and DARMAs, as mentioned before, are very popular right now because they offer a way to avoid a lot of the uncertainty and difficulties that come with these programs. Now, TSMIT may not be overly addressed by these issues, but what the government is doing is they are looking to change the visa system. They're going to introduce a new 482 program, which is divided into three categories. We'll touch on in a bit later. And they are hierarchical categories. Okay, so you've got your high skilled and then you've got your lowest skilled at the bottom. And those lowest skilled occupations and roles will be subject to a much higher level of scrutiny. It will be more equivalent to having a labour agreement rather than having the standard visa program. So if you're in a sector and I think the aged care labour agreement is essentially a trial balloon for the government on this type of thing. They've got the unions much more involved. The unions have to be part of the discussion. The employer has to sign a MOU with the union about certain cooperation and certain undertakings. And in exchange, the department is granting you an aged care labour agreement. Now, what's going to happen is that essentially all occupations and positions which fall below the TSMIT, such as aged care, such as potentially childcare, and agriculture, will be subject to these new type of arrangements. That's where employers who need workers below that salary threshold are going to find themselves in a much more regulated space. And it's something that really needs to be considered because there are fewer and fewer Australians in the labour market just due to demographic shifts. And that's a trend that's going to continue over the next decade. So how you source the right people for your organisation is going to be increasingly important. The scope of these changes, okay, as I said before, the TSMIT impacts not just your future applications, it does impact all future applications for 482s and for 494s, but it also impacts those 186 applications. So we all know that when a temporary visa holder comes to Australia and they're working on a 482 visa, their goal is almost exclusively to obtain permanent residency down the track. That's 2-3 years of work plus the processing time. Okay. if that person is to be eligible for permanent residency at the end of that process, they are going to need to maintain parity with TSMIT, and their remuneration is going to need to increase over time. Otherwise, they're not going to qualify. And if they don't qualify, they're potentially going to look at other options, other employers who are willing to sponsor. One of the key changes that the government has flagged in its November rejig of the program is greater movement between employers. Okay, the nomination process, the process to renominate people to transfer their sponsorship is likely to get easier. And the government believes that that is going to reduce exploitation. I think what the government hasn't understood is the costs and expenses that employers go to in order to bring people to Australia, and the complexity and all the other factors that employers are working with that just increase costs. So it's a very tricky situation, and employers are going to have to, I think, maintain a lot of awareness. Obviously, the change is also going to have the potential for broader wage implications across your organisation. If you've got 100 gelato makers spread across Australia, some above, some below TSMIT, there is going to be upward wage pressure because of those temporary visa holders, because of the TSMIT changes. And how you deal with that as an organisation is going to have to be factored into your business strategy. Future changes. Well, before the 23rd of November, which is when we're scheduled for that big rejig, you will see applications being subject to the new TSMIT from 1 July. Applications lodged prior will be assessed under the current TSMIT of 70,000. Okay. So anything lodged until the 31st of June should be fine. But after that, you're going to need to have that TSMIT above 73,150, or the market salary rates, apologies, above 73,150. The other factor to think about there is that any advertisement you're doing today, if you've only just started, should reflect a TSMIT, should reflect a market salary rate, apologies, above that 73 figure. Anything that you're advertising today, unless the advertisement's already been running for 3 weeks or 2 weeks, is going to need to be at that higher threshold. And as we've discussed, as I've sort of mentioned before, if you've got a remuneration range in your advertisement, which is 65 to 75, you're probably going to be okay, provided that the person's going to be paid above 73,150, and you've got a justification for that. But if your advertisement is up saying 65 to 72, that's not going to work. Okay, so that's something to be conscious of. And then from 23rd of November, we're going to move to this new model. Now, one of the challenges with this new model is the government is still working its way through tier 1 and tier 2. Okay, tier 1 is going to be high salary, above 135,000, high skilled. Now, high skilled in this context means professionals, okay, white collar, essentially. It's not going to include trades. Now, the reasonableness of that aside, it's important to remember. High skilled specialist pathway, tier 1. Tier 2 is going to be based on an occupation list that the government is currently consulting on. And then tier 3 is going to be this cohort of occupations where remuneration is below 70,000. So aged care, to some extent, potentially some aspects of hospitality, childcare, agricultural, but the government is working through it. And given the current government's predilections and political positions, you can expect that it will involve direct and much more substantial engagement with unions than previous labour agreement arrangements have involved. So that's the presentation for today. I'm sure we haven't covered everything. It is a surprisingly expansive topic. It involves, I think, a lot of detailed thinking for organisations. We all know that wage costs are most employers' number one costs in a service-focused economy, and dealing with those costs is very challenging. And we can see, looking at the future, it's going to become an increasing challenge. The way that you structure your pricing, the way that you look at and engage with future employees, how you go about finding the people you need in the labour market is going to be an ongoing challenge in Australia for the next decade or so, as the the current generation looks to retire. Fewer and fewer people coming into the labour market due to demographic issues. There's just a relatively small cohort of people who will be coming into employment in the next 10 years. And then this real competing sort of populist perception around the role of migrants and, housing and infrastructure and things like this. So all of those factors mean that this is going to be a space that gets more and more challenging. I think that organizations who are engaging really deeply and looking at this from a broad perspective, looking at what are their future pathways for talent, they are the organizations that are going to succeed, because the market is only going to become more and more challenging. So with that, I want to thank everyone for sticking around. It's been really great to have you all here. I will be available for the next few minutes. If anyone has any questions, more than happy to answer any questions that you might have. And we'll certainly make a few corrections to the slides and circulate them around to everyone before sending them out. Okay. Well, well, thank you, everyone. Real pleasure to speak to you all. Have a great day, and thank you all for your time.